How many of you remember seeing this at the grocery store? You were standing in line with your mom, your grandparents, or your own kids. The cart was full. The cashier was slow. And somewhere between the candy bars and the gossip magazines, there it was, a black and white newspaper claiming that Bat Boy had escaped, that Elvis was alive, that aliens were advising the president, that the vice president was secretly a robot. You probably did not believe it. That was not the point. The point was that you looked, then you laughed, then maybe you picked it up. And if the cover was strange enough, maybe you bought it, just to reward whoever had the nerve to print it. For almost 3 decades, Weekly World News turned the supermarket checkout line into a doorway into a stranger America. It looked cheap. It looked ridiculous. It looked like the last thing on earth a serious person would ever pay money for. And every week, more than 1 million people did. Because Weekly World News understood something the respectable papers never did. People do not only pay for information, sometimes they pay for the feeling of a world stranger than their own. So, what happened to it? To answer that, we have to go back, before Bat Boy, before the aliens, before this thing became America's favorite fake newspaper. Because the story does not begin with a monster. It begins with an old machine that still needed something to print. Weekly World News began with a practical problem. Generoso Pope Jr. already owned one of the most powerful supermarket tabloids in America, the National Enquirer. But in 1979, the Enquirer was moving into color. That left an old black and white printing press sitting idle. And in the tabloid business, an idle press is just wasted money. So, Pope did not shut the machine down. He gave it something stranger to print. That is how Weekly World News was born. It did not arrive as a respected newspaper. It arrived as a strange little product built from leftover machinery, supermarket shelf space, and a single tabloid instinct. That one outrageous headline could stop a shopper in their tracks. And it worked faster than a sensible idea probably should have. The first issue reportedly sold around 120,000 copies for a paper running on a press nobody else wanted. The name did a lot of the work. Weekly World News sounded broad, serious, almost official. It promised the world. What it actually delivered was a black and white universe where every page felt like a secret file, a government leak, or a dispatch from a country that did not quite exist. Other tabloids chased glossy celebrity photos. Weekly World News looked rougher, cheaper, older. It was not trying to look polished. It was trying to look discovered. The press was built to print yesterday's news. Instead, it started printing tomorrow's weirdness. The mistake is thinking Weekly World News worked only because people believed it. Some did, but most readers understood exactly what they were holding. They were not buying information. They were buying the pleasure of reading something that should not exist. The others promised celebrity scandal. Who was dating whom? Which actor had gained weight over the summer? Weekly World News promised something stranger. A universe where aliens were quietly advising the president, where Elvis had faked his death and might run again, where a half-Bat Boy was loose somewhere in the hills of West Virginia. It was not just nonsense, it was coherent nonsense. And coherent nonsense is powerful because it gives the reader a role to play. One of the paper's own editors later described its audience as 3 kinds of people: the ones who believed it, the ones who knew it was fake but loved it anyway, and the ones who half believed. Notice what is missing from that list. Nobody is being fooled. Even the believers were not victims, they were fans. The whole paper was built for a reader smart enough to be in on the joke, and willing to pay to keep the joke going. Weekly World News was not asking you to believe, it was asking you to play along. Then came the face people still remember, Bat Boy, half human, half bat, and somehow more memorable than half the real celebrities of the 1990s. He was found in a cave in West Virginia. Then he escaped. Then the FBI was hunting him. Then he was back again. And somewhere along the way, he stopped being a one-time headline and became a strange little friend you half expected to see at the checkout line each week. That repetition was the whole trick. Weekly World News was not just inventing fake stories. It was building a fictional universe and disguising it as breaking news. The characters came back, and they crossed over. Batboy endorsed Al Gore for president. An alien named Pilad had an affair with Hillary Clinton, right there on the cover, complete with an official photo. A furious columnist named Ed Anger showed up week after week to rage about speed limits in rainforests. Aliens, monsters, dead celebrities, and back-from-the-grave presidents all seemed to live inside the same black and white America, and they kept bumping into each other. Today we have a name for this. We'd call it a shared universe. Weekly World News was running the same playbook as a Marvel movie, with recurring characters, ongoing storylines, and crossovers. It was doing it on newsprint, decades before anyone called it that. And here is the strange part. The more impossible that world became, the more familiar it felt. The aliens were ridiculous, but they were your aliens. You knew them. That familiarity is what lifted the paper above a one-time gag. It turned a joke you read into a world you visited. At its peak, Weekly World News did not need you to come looking for it. It found you at the exact moment your attention was cheapest and easiest to steal, the supermarket checkout line. You were not reading the news. You were not making any serious choice about media. You were bored. You were trapped. And you were waiting for the cashier to finish with the person ahead of you. That sounds like a small detail. It was the entire business model, a philosophy, not just a location. Most newspapers had to earn your trust before they could earn your attention. Weekly World News reversed the order. It needed 1 second, one impossible headline, one black and white photo strange enough that your eyes stopped moving, and enough people stopped that the numbers became serious. At its peak, the paper's circulation is often remembered at around 1.2 million copies an issue, more than 1 million people, every single week, paying for a newspaper that told them aliens were running for office. It got bigger than a tabloid has any right to get. In the run-up to the 2000 election, a sitting presidential candidate, George W. Bush, happily posed for photographers holding up a copy, opened to the headline, "Space Alien Backs Bush for President." When the paper reported that a dozen U.S. senators were actually space aliens, some of them played along and confirmed it. The most ridiculous newspaper in America had quietly become part of the culture it was making fun of. Impulse buying is not only about price, it is about permission. A shopper did not need to believe a word of it, only that the laugh was worth a couple of dollars. That was the genius. Weekly World News turned boredom into curiosity, curiosity into a double take, and a double take into a habit. Before the infinite scroll, there was the checkout line. And for almost 30 years, Weekly World News owned the bored glance. But the thing that made Weekly World News fun depended on a boundary. You knew where it lived. It was on the rack. It was black and white. It sat next to the candy bars and the gossip magazines. It looked outrageous on purpose. Even when you played along, you always understood the frame around it. For years, that frame was everything. And then, by the late 1990s, the machine started to shake, from the inside first. In 1999, American media came under new ownership. Over the next couple of years, many of the old editors and writers, the ones who knew how to calibrate that strange, specific Weekly World News voice, began to leave. That mattered more than it sounds. Anyone can write nonsense. The trick was writing nonsense that still sounded like the news. That was a skill, and it walked out the door one person at a time. But losing the editors was only the first crack. The second was bigger, and it came from outside. The internet did not kill Weekly World News by competing with it. It killed the frame. For decades, Weirdness had an address, that black and white paper at the checkout. Then, slowly, Weirdness stopped having an address at all. It was everywhere. And once the strange was everywhere, the one thing Weekly World News had truly owned, being the place you went to find it, quietly stopped existing. Take away the paper, the rack, the candy bars, And the exact same headline could come from anywhere now, even from someone who meant it. The absurdity did not disappear. It escaped. By the mid-2000s, the numbers said so out loud. The paper, once remembered for selling more than 1 million copies an issue, was now moving a fraction of that. Around 2000, circulation had slipped to roughly 328,000. A year later, about 275,000. By 2006, it was down to somewhere near 83,000 copies an issue. That was not just a shrinking number. It was the sound of the checkout line machine breaking, step by step. Because the old system had always depended on a very specific chain of events, the paper had to be printed, trucked to the stores, and win its place on the rack by the register. A shopper had to be standing there, bored at exactly the right moment. The cover had to stop their eyes. And then, in that tiny window between the laugh and the cashier, they had to decide the laugh was worth paying for. For 30 years, every link in that chain held. Online, not one of them was necessary. A ridiculous headline did not need a printing press. A doctored photo did not need a spot on the rack. A wild claim did not need a weekly deadline, and a joke did not need to be bought before it could be passed around. Everything Weekly World News had built its business on. The print run, the trucks, the shelf space, the impulse, the purchase. The internet simply skipped them. In 2007, after 28 years, the print edition of Weekly World News came to an end. The brand would limp on online, a website, a paywall, years of relaunches, but a website could only keep the name alive. It could not rebuild the moment, because Weekly World News had never really been just content. It had been a place, a pause, a strange paper object sitting at eye level while a stranger bagged your groceries. The curiosity survived. The purchase did not. The print paper was gone, but the strangest thing about Weekly World News is what refused to go with it. Characters. Bat Boy had stopped being a headline a long time ago. He first crawled out of that West Virginia cave in the early 90s, but he kept coming back. He became an off-Broadway musical. He turned up on merchandise, in the memories of people who had not bought the paper in 20 years. And in 2024, Netflix announced it was developing a live-action Bat Boy series, a character from a defunct supermarket tabloid, still alive, decades after the tabloid that invented him had died. That is the difference between content and a character. Most fake stories vanish the moment the trick is over. Bat Boy stayed, because somewhere along the way, he stopped feeling like a trick at all. He became something gentler, a mascot for a stranger, sillier version of America. The kind of ridiculous you could laugh at without having to argue about it. And that points to the real reason people remember Weekly World News at all. It isn't the individual stories. Almost nobody can quote a single article. What they remember is the frame around the feeling. Because Weekly World News belonged to a time when absurdity wore a costume. It was black and white. It was oversized. It sat on a supermarket rack, practically winking at you. You and the paper were in on the same joke, and you both knew exactly where the joke lived. The joke had a place. Today, the same bait is everywhere. The shock, the impossible headline, the too good to be true. But the wink is gone. The headline is still ridiculous. The difference is that now it can be optimized, monetized, politicized, and believed. That is what makes Weekly World News feel, in hindsight, strangely innocent. A paper that lied to your face for 30 years somehow looks honest next to the feed in your pocket because it never once asked you to actually believe it. People do not miss fake news. They miss when fake news still looked fake. So, what happened to Weekly World News? The paper went away. The checkout line changed. The black and white covers disappeared from the place where millions of people first saw them. But the weirdness did not die. It just lost its address. It used to live in one spot, a rack where you could pick it up, laugh, and put it back. Now it lives everywhere, and it followed you off the supermarket shelf and into the phone in your hand. We feel nostalgic for it now, but not for the lies. We're nostalgic for a time when the lies wore a costume, when the most unbelievable thing in the building was clearly labeled, oversized and black and white, sitting in the one corner of the store, reserved for the ridiculous. Today there is no corner reserved for the ridiculous. The ridiculous is the whole store. Weekly World News did not lose to the truth. It lost to a world where every headline learned to act like Weekly World News. So, the next time you are standing in a checkout line, cart full, cashier slow, and something on a screen stops your eyes with a headline too strange to be real, remember that we used to have a place for that feeling. It was black and white. It cost a couple of dollars, and everybody standing in that line knew it was a joke. We didn't just lose a newspaper, we lost the wink.